Welcome to the McCain Institute. The McCain Institute was founded to honor the legacy of service to our nation of Senator and Mrs. McCain and the McCain family going back generations. And that legacy is about humanitarian action and work. It's about human rights. It's about national security. And above all, about leadership, character-driven, values-driven leadership. And that is what we seek to promote at the McCain Institute. We try to make sure that we always position ourselves as a do tank. We try to be an organization that is focused on action more than being a think tank and proposing ideas. The simple way to think of it is, rather than coming up with things that we want to recommend that other people do, we ask ourselves the question, what can we do? And that is the spirit in which we've launched our work in combating human trafficking. And with tremendous leadership and partnership with Mrs. Cindy McCain, who is the chairperson of our advisory council on human trafficking, and I see at least a few others connected to that council here today, we have been able to raise public awareness. We've been able to promote original research. We've been able to see stronger legislation passed in the state of Arizona. We've contributed towards legislation in other states in the Mountain West. We've developed partnerships with law enforcement. We've promoted training for law enforcement and social services. We have worked with other NGOs that either are experts in human trafficking, like Polaris, and they run the national hotline, or alternatively, those who have been involved in development of technology, such as Thorn, where we work together to produce a spotlight software that helps law enforcement sift through all the massive information on the internet to categorize and standardize, make it easier to look for patterns that might indicate human trafficking on the web. These are just some examples of the things that we have done to try to play a very active, hands-on role in fighting this terrible, terrible phenomenon that still exists throughout our country and throughout the world today. Today's discussion is part of our conversation series and part of our awareness raising, and the focus particularly today is child sex trafficking, the victimization of children, and its connection to child welfare system. How does the child welfare system deal with that? Does it create conditions that are conducive to this? Can we turn that around and make sure that we are actually using it as a tool for helping children? And so with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mrs. Cindy McCain to introduce our moderator, and we'll get the conversation started. And thank you again so much for coming. Mrs. McCain.
Thank you very much for coming. I love to see a packed room and people standing. I'm sorry we don't have chairs for all of you, but that's a good thing today. I really am excited about this. First of all, thank you for coming for obvious reasons. This is a terribly important issue. When I watched my own state's child welfare system collapse, it was made very abundantly clear to me that we had to get involved in this issue in a major way as it relates to trafficking. And so we have managed to compile today a group of experts on this issue, people that have experienced it, have worked in it, have lived it, every aspect of it, and are here to not only exchange ideas and discussion, but also to hear from all of you. Our moderator today is Malika Saar. As you know, she needs no introduction. She is one of the more amazing women on this issue that I have ever had the opportunity to know. I'm grateful I can call you my friend. Thank you. So welcome, enjoy. I hope this is a good learning experience for everybody, and I hope we can do more of these soon. Thanks for coming.
Hi, everyone. It's really a blessing to be with you today. Thank you for coming. We are going to do introductions of the panel and then really start to package the issue of the intersection between child trafficking and child welfare. And I think what's important about today's conversation is that what distinguishes the experience of children trafficked in this country is their interaction with the child welfare system, because we know so many of our children who are bought and sold here are also coming out of foster care. So we will look into that more deeply, and I'm so blessed and honored to be on the panel with individuals here, starting with Congresswoman Bass. If you can introduce yourself and then go down the panel.
Sure. Congresswoman Bass, I am serving in my third term in Congress. I come from Los Angeles, where I represent a community in LA. You know, LA is so big, we have actually 12 representatives in the region in just LA County. And I have been involved and concerned about this issue for many, many years.
Hello, I'm Barbara Amaya, and I am a senior technical advisor at a local nonprofit, SeraphimGlobal, and I'm also a author, an advocate, and a survivor of human trafficking.
My name is Allison Green. I'm a supervising attorney at DC's Children's Law Center. We are attorneys who represent the best interest of children in the foster care system in our local system.
So let's get started. And Congresswoman Bass, I want to start with you. And really, when a couple of years ago, my organization, the Human Rights Project for Girls, recognized that we had to get the child welfare leaders in this town to understand how our children are being trafficked and how many of those children are coming out of foster care. And there were very few voices and champions on that issue of the intersection between child welfare and child trafficking. And really the first voice, the most powerful voice, was Congresswoman Bass. And so Congresswoman, if you can just talk about, in terms of coming out of LA, understanding the lives of our vulnerable children as deeply as you do, what brought you, really as one of the first voices, to shine the light on this intersection between child welfare and child trafficking?
Well, actually, when I learned about it, and I was just absolutely horrified. And what happened was, in LA, there was a story in the local paper about how there was a big arrest of, you know, girls, and also, I don't like to use the word Johns because to me they're child molesters, but it was traffickers and girls. And the FBI had formed this task force called Innocence Lost, and I went and I met with them. And I asked them, and they did a presentation for me, and they talked about the girls. And it was just my instinct that said, I bet a lot of these girls are foster girls. And they really didn't have documentation of it. But they said they guessed it was around 40%, and I assumed it was much more. And then you start piecing it together, and you know that, you know, a lot of times when the girls are perceived as having run away, what happens to them? And it was so bad in LA that literally there's a web page on the website for the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services of missing kids.
Wow.
They don't know where all the kids are.
Oh my gosh.
And some of them they know were taken by their birth parents, but some of them they don't know.
Right.
And then when kids run away from the system, if they're not found, that's you know, kind of it. And so it just horrified me. And then in LA, we also have the intersection, and I know this is in other places, but not necessarily everywhere. But we have the intersection of gangs who are involved in trafficking, street gangs who have diversified their criminal activity away from just drug trafficking and now trafficking girls. And it was just, you know, horrific that something like this could go on. But I do have to mention, Malik, that the irony is I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and yesterday we were doing the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report. And we're so worried about everybody around the world. And a couple of years ago when I sat for that report, I'm like, well, where's our section? You know, because we need to hold ourselves accountable.
That's what I say. That's exactly what I say.
And I want to follow up on that because, you know, we look at what happens in other parts of the world with children being trafficked. And in this country, right, there is not only the reality of the ways in which the brokenness of our child welfare system can make our girls more vulnerable to being bought and sold, right? So often when we look at our child welfare involved children who are being trafficked, many of them, if not most of them, are girls who have been put in more than one placement, right? The shared narrative is girls who have been put in multiple placements in care and often run away from care because of that. But there's this other reality, the other system that they interface with, which is the juvenile justice system.
Right.
How we see the criminalization of our girls and boys, but mostly our girls. 1,000 children every year who are arrested for prostitution, even though most of them are not of age to consent. And we know that there's a racial dynamic here where 59% of those children arrested for prostitution are African American. And so as someone who just sat in that committee room yesterday, could you also talk about the distinction of not only the added vulnerability of our children who are bought and sold in foster care, that disappeared often of the foster care system, but also criminalized
Right. Well, I mean, to me, when I, again, first began to realize this, the idea of even using that term, the girl is not old enough to consent for sex, but yet she's called a prostitute, just made absolutely no sense at all. But we do know that a lot of the girls are arrested, and they're arrested for a variety of things. They're arrested for prostitution, but they also might be arrested for other petty crimes related to that, or related to drug addiction, or related to their behavior. And the idea that you see a child, and that's really, to me, a cry for help.
Right.
When a child is acting out, like that poor girl in, where was that, where they tackled her? Yeah, South Carolina. I mean, if her parent had come in and done that in the room, the parent would have been arrested.
Right.
But what I learned about South Carolina, actually, is that they've criminalized adolescents, because in school in South Carolina, and apparently a number of the southern states, if you misbehave, it's actually a crime. They've made it a misdemeanor. Whereas in other places, if you misbehave, I mean, you might get detention, you might get this, but you get arrested. Whoa. And so there's all of these entry points into the criminal justice system. And then we know that once the girls are in the system, that's also a recruitment place, right, where other girls might recruit. So there's so many places where our girls can fall down the rabbit hole. And then it's a question of how you bring them out again.
That's right. And Barbara, you are a survivor. You have the lived experience at another point in time when children were trafficked in this country, not in the same numbers, not the same issues of vulnerability. But if you could just give voice to how you have come to the issue and come to understand what this generation of children who are being bought and sold need.
I know there is, of course, the added element today of the internet, right? And that's added a whole nother aspect. But when I was a young child, I ran away from my home. The summer I turned 12, and I continued to run away from my home. And I think, like so many other, not all, but so many other victims, I was being abused in my home, so I ran away. And I was in the the juvenile justice system, and I was in the welfare. I was committed to the state. I was sent to detention centers and reform schools and other schools, and I was I fell down that rabbit hole because I was misidentified, and I wasn't identified at all as a child in need of services. I was actually labeled incorrigible and uncontrollable.
Right, incorrigible.
And I didn't even know what that word meant at the time. But anyway, and I kept going through these different systems, and not once was it ever addressed what was happening to me. Why was I running away from this suburban Fairfax, Virginia home to pretty much, DC was in flames at the time. It wasn't a good place for a 12-year-old to run away to. And, I fell into the hands of traffickers, human traffickers, and for the next 10 years, I ended up in New York, and I was trafficked there. And once again, I was criminalized in the system. And I'd been programmed to say I was 18 or I was 21 and give fake names and fake false addresses. And I was criminalized and got a criminal record that I've since been able to go back and vacate. But I think some of the tactics are the same. Traffickers, they found a model that works, how to turn a child into a commodity. But today, of course, the added element of the internet has just made it all worse. Right. But I think a lot of the misidentification is still happening, just like it happened then. It's still happening today.
And I think what was true then, and is certainly true now, is that we have created this false distinction, right, between raping a child and paying to rape a child. And in the case of the latter, there's impunity for the buyer, right? And there's also the criminalization of the victim. I mean, you were, and kids today are in a situation where, by virtue of being a child,
remember,
and a victim of what essentially is commercial serial rape, both of those conditions ought to be protected conditions, child, victim, and yet neither were contemplated then or are contemplated now to the degree that we should see when our youth, when our children are being subject to this form of commercial rape.
It's rape. You can't say child prostitute, and you can't say that John, I can't stand that word, was having sex with a child. No, he wasn't. He was raping the child. And yet You know, I was, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, getting a criminal record, being arrested for, loitering for the purpose of prostitution, whatever it was in Manhattan, and the, adult male was being sent home, and I with nothing, no charge.
So, Allison, I want to go to you because, we find ourselves in this dual space, right, when we talk about child welfare and child trafficking. So part of what we do as an advocacy community is to say, this is not a criminal justice issue. We should not be criminalizing our children for being subject to commercial rape. And so we argue this is about child protection. This is really for the child welfare system to be able to help our kids because these children are in fact abused and neglected children. And, there's also the reality that many of us know that many of the children are the runaways from group homes, those who have disappeared from foster care. And in many ways, how they have been trafficked or that they have been trafficked is often the manifestation of the brokenness in the child welfare system. So if you could just speak to that, on one hand, we want this to be contemplated not as a juvenile justice, but as a child welfare situation. And at the same time, we know the very real ways in which child welfare has actually rendered our kids more vulnerable because of placement in group homes, because of multiple placements. So if you could just speak to that and from the DC perspective.
Sure. It's a really difficult tension. And as an advocate, it's a difficult tension because to get services and safety for a child client, they effectively need to be in a public system. But we don't have a public system that I have found that is made for sexually exploited youth because they don't fit in any of the boxes we already have. It does not make sense to put them in the juvenile justice system. And most people understand there's a reluctance to do that because it's harmful. It's doubly traumatic. But it also, likewise, often doesn't make sense to put them in the child welfare system, especially in cases where their parent has not been complicit. But we have seen families where a parent has to essentially plead to neglect in order to get services for their child, even though they have not been willing this to happen. So it's very difficult to try to take incredibly complex cases and fit them in a box. And we see the same thing you're talking about, this where, frankly, whichever system you touch first is how the trajectory of your case and your life goes at that point. And it's really up to chance. So you can have the same child who may come in as a status offender, which is what we call a runaway youth, and who is treated really from a punitive perspective. And is a young woman may be shackled, she may be detained, and she's brought in because she's truant from school or running away, even though that's only a symptom of the behavior. And we'll deal with that in the juvenile court on the first level of DC Superior Court. However, if her John is picked up and prosecuted, then upstairs he's tried, and she's brought in as a victim witness. And she's protected much more, but she's not getting any services up there. So the duality of that, it almost blows one's mind that in the same day you can be going from a courtroom downstairs where she's treated as a criminal and then go upstairs where she's treated as a victim. And it really depends on what you get.
Although that's progress, because in most situations when a child testifies against her trafficker, she is not treated as, she's treated as one criminal testifying against another criminal. So glad to hear that we have some form of protection happening in DC. Congresswoman Bass, I know you wanted to respond to this.
Yeah, I did, because one of the problems, and this is just the craziness of some of our systems. So in the child welfare system, we define child abuse and child neglect as by a parent, right? So if it's by a trafficker, then that doesn't fit within our thinking of the system, which means we need to change the system. And so one of the things about legislation, frankly, that's frustrating is that you can get legislation passed, but unless you do the work to make sure that people know it's passed, it doesn't really mean anything. And so we did get a bill passed, the Strengthening Child Welfare Response to Trafficking Act. And this bill basically says that states and county child welfare departments are supposed to develop protection plans that outline provisions and procedures to identify and assess all children known or suspected to be victims of trafficking. But here's the problem, is that all the systems are overburdened. And so we had this fight in California where the child welfare system was like, oh no, please don't give us any more kids. It was like, well, you know what, I'm sorry, we got to figure out how to expand the system. That's just not acceptable. And so I think, you know, on one end, it might be to fight for the implementation of that. And I wonder, you know, if there's a way to do that. Another part of the bill provides for grants for states and counties to begin to do the training that they need to do. Because it's not enough just to say, child welfare system, now you deal with it.
Right.
You got to train the social workers so they know how to identify. And then you also have to provide, I mean, there needs to be a continuum, right? So one of the biggest problems is, where do you take the child? And so if the police aren't arresting it, you know, et cetera, but the social workers have to be trained, law enforcement have to be trained. But there is supposedly grants to do that now. So I wonder if there's ways to...
Yeah, I mean, the data piece is so important because there's no good data on the exact numbers in our country for a variety of reasons. One, there's inherent underreporting because of denial, because some young women have experienced what's called traumatic bonding with the perpetrator, so they're trying to protect. And also because of the inherent nature of the crime, it goes across boundaries, especially here in the D.C. area. We're so uniquely situated. You could get on the metro in Virginia and be in 3 different jurisdictions within a half an hour. So, these data systems don't talk across state lines.
They don't talk.
So we don't have good data, and that's a problem from a policy perspective, but it's really a problem as an on-the-ground case handler, because data is what informs funding, and funding is what helps get placements and services for my clients.
So I just want to lift up, though, this change we now have in law, federal law, where last September, President Obama signed into law the Strengthening Families Act Preventing Child Trafficking. And part of that law requires now child welfare agencies to assess and identify for child trafficking, right? So this is the first time now child welfare agencies are being required to identify and assess for children who are being trafficked. We are still waiting for ACF to come out with the proper assessment tools to give to child welfare agencies to do that type of assessment. But we do have an opportunity to finally start looking at the numbers, which I think is important in terms of getting at proper data. But go ahead.
But I guess I would ask you, before the assessment tools can you argue that? I mean, can you, instead of that parent going, you know, I have to plead or whatever, I mean, are you able to use the law? In other words, to make the child welfare system in D.C. respond to the girls.
So the child welfare system in D.C., like many other states, takes the position that they intervene in parental child abuse and parental child neglect. And if a perpetrator is not a parent or caregiver...
Right, but that's what the law was supposed to have changed.
So what it has not changed is our local definition of abuse or neglect. So from their perspective, although some advocates may disagree, and they cannot prove a case of abuse or neglect because of the statutory language. What we are seeing is there is a movement to start complying with the Strengthening Families and Preventing Sex Trafficking Act. Did I make go?
It goes
going in and out.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so I think we will have better data 2 or 3 years from now, because now they're starting the process of collecting it, but it is going to take time to do.
That don't work.
It's going to take time to actually start the collection process, start the report back, and then get the funding that comes from that.
That is always
and I think, Congresswoman, back to your... but we're seeing this across the country. I mean, our organization is getting calls from different child welfare agencies asking about how do we do this assessment because we don't know proper ways of identifying children who are being bought and sold. But then your piece of legislation was part of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act.
Right.
And what was so powerful and transformational about it is that it recognizes child trafficking as a form of abuse and neglect. Right? And that was based on how in most states, including the district, if you think you're seeing a child being bought and sold and you call up the child welfare hotline, they tell you to hang up and call law enforcement, right? So if we're trying to end the criminalization of children for trafficking, it doesn't help that child welfare tells you to call law enforcement. So Florida was an example where they trained their child welfare workers to recognize and identify trafficking as a form of abuse and neglect. And we have the challenge now, given that your law has passed, how do we make it a reality across the states, across the child welfare agencies, to understand it's their problem
right.
too?
And I think that's why when you pass a law, you have to have the organizing and the advocacy to fight for the enforcement of the law, because to say that it's going to take 2 or 3 years to find data for a social worker to then, be able to identify whether a kid is trafficked is problematic.
It is, and it must also be more problematic because DC just passed the law saying that they're moving away from arresting children to putting children
Safe harbor.
in safe spaces, public health spaces. So if you don't have child welfare engaged, it makes that shift all the more hard.
But to me, it still seems like an advocacy issue.
Indeed, indeed. So I think that's right. And I kind of want to surface another advocacy issue we're talking about, this is the challenge of we've passed really good law, and now we have to see proper implementation at the state and local level. But there's something else here around child welfare that hasn't been looked at that I want to talk about more, which is that I have really seen this issue as what is unearthing so much of what's not working in child welfare, right? And so the first time I understood how in danger our girls were was an event that we did of girls who had been trafficked as well as had been put in the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system. And they were talking to a group of lawmakers. And I asked them to choose on their own how they wanted to begin their narrative of being bought and sold.
Oh.
And it was about 14 girls who were in the room. And they were in a fishbowl. And all the lawmakers and staffers were on the outside. And every single girl on her own decided to start the story of being trafficked with the story of how she was abused in care. And the girls shared how they were abused in care by an uncle, a friend of the family, another child, and did not disclose the abuse because they were either afraid of being removed to a group home, or they were afraid of being removed from the home away from the sibling. So if they were taken out of the home, that would leave their brother or sister to be abused. And part of it made me understand, how do we deal, right, with this issue of children being abused in care and having the supports to be able to give voice to that? Because I found it remarkable that every single girl started her story of being trafficked with the story of being abused in care and too afraid and unsupported to disclose.
And you, by virtue of being in care, these are youth for who came in because of abuse or neglect, so abuse may feel normative to them. That might be a pattern that they're used to, so to experience again in a foster home, the inclination is not to report or to run because that's just how things have gone, and that just might feel like how they will continue to go. So this system is often not the safe haven that it strives to be because basic needs aren't being met. It's very difficult. To go back to what we were saying earlier about the runaway issues, many youth, even those who are not being exploited, run away. Runaways are a hallmark foster youth behavior. And we have youth who frequently run back to their biological parents, for example, or we call them runaways, but they're really maybe at a friend's house for the weekend where they're not supposed to be. So there's a large population of foster youth who are not, may stay out overnight, but they they don't worry the agency. And so running, which is a really important red flag for sexual exploitation, it no longer becomes alarming to the agency. And one of our jobs as advocates is to lift up those cases, to say, this is different. This is a youth you really need to start looking for now, because she's in danger, even being gone for 24 hours. This isn't a youth who's just visiting her mom for the weekend and the court doesn't want her to be there. This is different, and we need really good investigators looking urgently.
And, you know, when we did the testimony around the Strengthening Families Act, T, who is a survivor, said, nobody puts out an Amber Alert when we go missing.
I was just thinking about that. If anybody in here, if your kid didn't come home for 24 hours, what would you do? You would be a wreck. So how that's even normalized, you know what I mean, to say that that's okay. T also said that she feels that the child welfare system prepared her to be trafficked.
Definitely.
Because they moved her around from place to place, and everybody that was involved with her was paid. So she saw herself as a commodity. She made money for people. And it was devastating when she said that. I never forgot that, and it just made me feel the weight of the responsibility to address this issue.
Right. Barbara, did you want to add anything?
No, I was just saying, I say that all the time, that it was training ground, the early, child abuse, and then, the next abuse becomes kind of a normalized, because it already happened. And then you're in the system, and people are being paid to take care of you. And so when you're, being programmed by a trafficker and further turned into a commodity, it's kind of not so unusual, because you're kind of used to that happening in your life from an early age.
Right, right.
So it's definitely a training ground for traffickers.
And I do want to make sure that folks in the room know that now, because of Strengthening Families Act becoming law, that foster care placements, group homes, individual homes are required to report a child missing from care because of T's testimony and the idea that we have to be concerned when our kids in care go missing, that is a red flag that must be taken seriously.
Finally.
Well, and it's really about normalizing this. I mean, to me, and I always say this whenever I talk about this issue, is that when you think of foster youth, they're just like your own kids. So you don't know, if your kids are missing for 4 hours, you'd have a fit. So, I think we have to stop looking at them differently. If we have the frame of our own kids, and whatever our kids need, then foster kids need, then it's a whole different way to approach the issue.
I think that's right. I want to ask folks, because I know we have created a dismal picture of foster care. Right. So I also want to think about and talk about what can we do. We have had these very, I think, significant reforms in the last almost 2 years. So the fact that we've got significant reforms in 2 years is a big deal, to improve child welfare's response to our children who are trafficked. I think it's clear that there is a challenge already around implementation. But what else can we think about in terms of reforming child welfare to be more responsive as we move forward, so that we don't see this kind of added vulnerability for our children who are under our care, essentially?
Everybody talks about collaboration, and everybody talks about working with others, and I don't know how to make that. I don't know exactly how to make that happen, and how hard data is to collect. Data, how do you do that well? I don't have an answer to that, but I wish I did. It needs to be, we all know it needs to be looked at further, I don't know how to address that. I wish I did.
Allison, as someone on the ground who
one thing that I'm really kind of looking towards and hoping for is better therapeutic services to help young men, and especially young women who are experiencing this. Because even where youth have been properly identified, they're often referred for kind of a typical therapy service. And talk therapy is very useful for a lot of people. But there's many different types, there's different modalities. And sexual exploitation is different because of this operative psychology where the youth may not believe herself to have a problem to bring to a therapist, or may not have change she wants to make.
Right.
But we think a lot about this, what we call the stages of change model, where there's pre-contemplation and then contemplation. And she may not be insanely situated to another foster youth who wants to go talk about her past trauma history. So I would like to see the development of service providers who have more expertise and figuring out what really are the evidence-based practices for how to intervene and what programs work. Like, is it a survivor-led program? Is it someone with a background in domestic violence? Because there's a lot of parallels between the cycles of domestic violence and the cycles of child sexual exploitation. Is it someone who really understands trauma?
Crucial.
And so I would like kind of more information and then more resources about really tailored services that help, so that we're not just checking the box and saying, okay, this youth has a therapist, but I want them to have the right one.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I really think that there needs to be a large-scale movement in our country where families and kids that are involved in the system are at the center of it, and not just the people that are the quote-unquote experts. Because I happen to think that the best public policy is made when people who are the most affected are at the center and designing the policy. Because, you can pass all these laws based on your ideas, but a lot of times we pass laws that are contradictory, right? I mean, and we're so well-intentioned. I mean, laws that were passed years ago that said that we didn't want kids to languish in foster care, and so we gave a time period, or the person's parental rights were terminated. Well, if the mom is incarcerated, or if the mom is in treatment and she relapse and time runs out and then she loses her kids, and the kids feeling like, wow, I mean, my mom, the time ran out and my mom can't take care of me anymore. Now I'm shuttled off to somebody else. That was an extremely well-intentioned law. But again, I think if people are at the forefront of the law, and then once the law is passed, the forefront of the implementation, and what's very clear to me is that, we have to fight for implementation, because people aren't going to, and systems aren't going to they're not going to just look at TV and go, oh, they changed the law, let's stop everything we're doing and do something differently. They have to be pushed and forced. And so that's, what I would like to see happen in our country. And at the same time, if you build a broad-based movement like that, that movement can also help to change public awareness, raise public awareness. So again, kids are viewed as kids and not as something else.
I think that's exactly right. And I also want to just raise up this issue of trauma-informed care for our kids, because many of you in the room have been part of conversations where we've talked about how do we make a child welfare system that is trauma-informed, right? And I think the kids who are being exploited, not only are they in desperate need of trauma-informed care, as you've talked about, Allison, but there is also the need to deal with the pre-existing abuse that you have spoken to, and how that hurts a child so deeply. Then there is the reality of the commercial rape that has happened to the child repeatedly. And then there's the reality of being rendered property, right? And so a lot of times in terms of care for our kids who are exploited, there are a lot of good, meaningful efforts like doing yoga or making jewelry. And that's all good, but we need a standard of care that is trauma-informed, because our kids who are being hurt, who are being bought and sold, carry such intense injury. And it's not enough to simply do yoga or make a necklace. They deserve comprehensive care and attention, and long-term. Thank you.
Not 6 months.
Exactly.
Or 2 weeks.
Exactly.
Seriously?
Right.
Needs to be a little bit longer.
Exactly right. I want to
be as
throw
long
it
as it needs.
open
Long as
to
it
the
needs.
audience to hear what people's questions are for the panel. I see someone back there. I think we have someone back.
Oh.
Thank you. I've recently become involved with Mission 14, addressing sexual exploitation of children. As I'm sitting here, I'm looking at the base cause is child molesters. So if we brought public awareness more to the perpetrators
Right.
and went after them,
Right.
stop smacking them on the hands. I mean, we changed the public's view on smoking. Back in the day, we would all be sitting here smoking. Now you're a criminal almost if you smoke. So why don't we get public perception and laws changed so that the perpetrators are treated as such?
But that's what I was referring to when I said a broad-based movement, because you need to change social norms. And we've watched that. I mean, we're in the middle of changing all kinds of social norms right now, LGBT issues. I mean, just think about it a few years ago. But I can think of in my lifetime alcohol, tobacco, where domestic violence, where certain behaviors are rendered unacceptable by society. To me, it is unacceptable to live in the world's richest country, and we can't figure out how to take care of 500,000 kids. There's 350 million people in this country. So there's about 500,000 kids that are in and out of our child welfare system in a given year. So, that to me should be kind of our standard. It should be unacceptable. And if you think about the fact that we are talking about kids in the child welfare system, they're under the government control. The government is the parent. And then the government becomes abusive.
And I just want to add to that, because this is like a big thing for me, which is that we have to go after demand. And the anti-trafficking community and our lawmakers have been very purposeful about going after the traffickers. And we should, right, because they are certainly culpable. There has been almost complete impunity for the buyers.
Right.
So when buyers are arrested, they are, if they are arrested, and they are rarely arrested, it is for solicitation. It is for a misdemeanor. But what they do in any other context would be construed as statutory rape. So we have all the laws on the books that we need to go after buyers, but we don't use them. We don't arrest buyers for statutory rape, sexual assault of a minor, child endangerment. We do not do that. The FBI did a major sting 2 weeks ago where they talked about the number of girls and boys who were rescued and the traffickers arrested. Not one buyer was arrested in that FBI sting. It's not about a lack of law, right? We have all the law we need now at the federal and state level to go after buyers for serious federal offenses, for serious felonies. And yet it's not being used because the behavior has been normalized. And as a human rights lawyer, I would say anytime you have a culture of impunity, that protects the violence. And we are protecting the violence against our kids. I promise this individual back here.
Thank you for one of the most honest discussions I've ever heard in Washington, D.C. on child trafficking. Congratulations on a great panel. My name is Lori Handrahan. I'm starting an organization called dataforjustice.org. Rosie O'Donnell has just agreed to be on our advisory board, and the Sundance Institute is interested in doing a documentary on my research. My question is, you mentioned perpetrators, you mentioned a racial element, and you mentioned a lack of data. So one of the couple things that weren't brought up that I would like to raise and then ask a question, more than 85% of all the men in this country who are arrested for child porn are elite white men. If more than 85% of black men or Muslim women were being arrested for child rape, there'd be an outcry. The media never even mentions this. It's up on my website. It's almost always under 3. It's brutal infant and child rape. And according to Europol, America houses more than half of the servers in the world that are distributing child porn. We know where those are. We don't shut that down. It's been reported in the UK media. The US media has not reported on it. My question is about child welfare. I'm looking for an investigator to help. In the state of Maine, a senior child protection worker named Cynthia Wellman came forward, and she said senior child protection workers are trafficking children with University of Maine professors. She was forced out of her job. She's now bankrupt. She sued the state. The judge threw it out. Nobody has even opened an investigation. We know child protection staff are involved in exploiting these children and in producing porn, and I'm hoping that you guys can address that issue. Thank you.
Well, I want to address that because we don't have stats that demonstrate that. And I do think it's important that we don't demonize child welfare or one group of folks in child welfare. I mean, I think that the majority of child welfare workers, my mother was a child welfare worker, are hardworking folks who do this work because they want the best for children. So I am not interested in engaging in the demonization of a whole entity. I think as in any space, whether we're talking about child welfare, juvenile justice, our schools, you always have bad actors. And we have to be able to call out those bad actors when they go against what the purpose of their jobs and the expectations of the community are to protect our kids. I think any child serving system, we must believe that people who engage in that child welfare, in that child serving system, want the best for kids.
Yes.
And when there are those bad actors, we be able to hold them accountable. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Yeah,
I agree.
I can say I am paid to complain about the child welfare system. That's my job. Is to be truly to be vigilant and to look at these cases closely and to report to the court when there are missteps. I've never seen or supervised a case with a worker where that's come to anyone's attention. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's certainly not a trend.
I agree with what you just said. I mean, in every group, there's going to be some bad apples.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Make sure the mic is.
I'm sorry. I'm
She's
being
coming.
unilateral here. I apologize.
No problem. Hello. Okay. Now I will be the one. Okay. Good. It's on. My name is Anna Della, and I work for the Church of Scientology National Affairs Office. And our group, together with many other faith-based and non-faith-based nonprofits, we were part of the coalition that was doing whatever we could to help support the legislation that recently passed on human trafficking. And I'm just wondering, how can civil society help at the next step? So good, we passed the legislation, what's next? Because us and other groups we work with on human trafficking issues, we are all equally concerned about the implementation. As the panel is excellent, I just want to thank you all. It's fantastic data, but we can see that there is further difficulties even when the laws are passed. What's next? How can you implement them? So what can we do as a civil society? How can we collaborate with you? What else can we do in Congress? Just would like to have your opinions on that.
Well, there's an organization that I work with. Inside of Congress, there's the Congressional Caucus on Foster Youth. Outside of Congress, there's another organization called the National Foster Youth Institute. And one of its main goals is to really create that broad-based movement. So to have activists in every single congressional district, because there's kids in the system in every single congressional district. But, I think that that individual counties and states need to be held accountable. So I would contact my county to say, this law was passed. What are you doing to prepare your system to train your workers so that they can screen folks? And granted, there's further implementation that needs to take place with assessment tools and all that, but there's no reason to sit and say I'm going to wait 2 or 3 years.
Until somebody brings it to me.
Exactly, until somebody brings it to me, because, you can have your social workers ask a few questions. Maybe they won't be tested and all of that, but, a few questions can get you to it. But systems around the country have to be prepared to deal with this population. That was the point of the law.
I would say encourage your members to become foster parents and to open up their doors, because one of the main issues we see in these cases is a lack of placement options.
That's right.
And these youth really oftentimes need to be moved to a different neighborhood or to a different school district for safety reasons, but we're constricted because there's just not enough open homes. So we're operating in very narrow margins. And what we really need is more foster homes and programs that have beds available so that we can have options. We have a spectrum of options so that youth can go there. If a youth needs to be in a single parent, female-headed household, because that's what's best for her, that's great. If a youth needs to be in a dual parent household for more supervision, so we have options to choose from, and we can really make recommendations that are in the youth's best interest. So I would say encourage your members to think about becoming foster parents.
I may be wrong, but my understanding is that years and years ago, before Stonewall, if the police raided a gay bar, the patrons' names ended up in the newspaper and people lost jobs and their families got broken up. Why can't we put the names of the buyers in the newspaper in Washington, D.C.?
So let me just quickly respond to that, although I'm not sure we want to replicate Stonewall tactics. But that still keeps it in the space of vice and prostitution. And it's not vice and prostitution. It is child abuse. And so the same way we handle other situations of child abuse, which is through the law, we should do that here. We don't need to do anything but arrest and prosecute for statutory rape, sexual assault of a minor, child endangerment. And once you start doing that, you will see the ways in which demand are not as present. And the popularity of websites like Backpage will not continue. The reason why Backpage or any other platform is so popular is because there is impunity there. There is not fear of being caught, arrested for purchasing a child. So I don't think we need to do anything else other than apply the law to these situations of child sexual abuse.
I would just add one thing. It might be good to have them be very high-profile cases. You know what I mean? Like any other criminal case. I mean, if that's really lifted up and explored in the media through that lens.
Exactly. Absolutely. We have time for one more question. I can't choose who it is, so whoever has the microphone can choose. Go ahead. I am sorry. I'm taking liberty to choose.
On a smaller local level that you would believe to be the most effective. I mean, when it comes to human trafficking, many people just divide themselves into two groups. One set of people are, well, this is a huge national issue that I'm not necessarily connected to, so let the policymakers and the NGOs deal with it. And the second group of people are, well, people like many of you here, the policymakers and the NGOs who are involved in pretty much making overarching policies and laws to help combat this issue. But really, how do you suggest we get the other people involved at the lowest level of origin? I mean, I'm not to say that we don't, I'm saying that if we're trying to change the social narrative, what can a regular individual do if they're not necessarily viewing it? And even if they are, what are we supposed to do? I mean, we already rely on a lot of different forms of human trafficking in our daily lives, such as buying products from slave labor across the country. How are we really supposed to deal with our national trafficking if we kindly already have a social narrative that justifies all the other forms of it?
Thank you for your question. Why don't we each take a stab at that?
I don't even want to start on that one.
Yeah, well, we could, that's a great question, and we could be here for another hour just addressing it. I would say in the smallest form, to push back on some of the cultural elements that have crept in that have made this okay in our media. So, like, I don't need to name specific movies or TV shows, but one of the most famous songs of the summer really like glorifies sex trafficking.
Don't go there.
And so I think just in the everyday, in your interactions with friends, family, other students. Well,
Let's say what it is.
It's called Trap Queen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Trap Queen?
Yeah. It's
Moving along.
I've never heard of that one, but I've heard of a lot of others with pimp and hoe.
I would say in your everyday interactions, when you encounter these things and people, or there's memes on the internet and things, people make jokes out of
Halloween
them.
costumes.
I think it's important to stop the conversation there and pause and cause people to reflect and say, this isn't something to joke about. This isn't something to make light of. So just to start in a very small way by having maybe an uncomfortable conversation and telling someone, that this isn't something we should really pay money to see. Yeah.
On that note, I remember when my adult daughter came home from middle school and said, I need a costume. We're having a pimp and hoe party at school. Oh, wow. I went, what? Because I hadn't self-identified as a victim at that point, and nobody knew my story. I was horrified. So normalizing, we need to stop at that very root level. This is a school function.
I don't think I need that.
I don't know. Okay.
I would say a couple of things. You can join the National Foster Youth Institute. One of the wonderful things of social media, you can be active on social media in your network and, spread awareness. You could become a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, because there's a terrible need for that. So one issue is to talk about kids that are currently trafficked. The other issue is to prevent other kids from being trafficked. So volunteering as a CASA, you mentioned becoming a foster parent. There's a tremendous need. So I think there's multiple ways that people can get involved. Mentoring. And mentoring, yeah.
I'm going to add one and then wrap up. In the last 5 years, major media outlets have used the term child prostitute 5,000 times.
Yeah.
We have a change.org petition asking
Yes.
the AP, which is really the standard bearer of language in major media outlets, to drop the term child prostitute because there's no such thing. So I would urge each of you, we have 93,000 signatures right now, to go to change.org, no such thing, and sign the no such thing petition urging the AP to drop the term child prostitute. There's no such thing. There are only survivors and victims of child rape. Woo. Excuse me. I want to thank you all. I'm sorry for the difficulties with the microphones, but thank you so much for being here and being part of this conversation.
Please join me also. Malika, you did a fabulous job moderating this, so thank you. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you, Mrs. McCain, for your being with us today as well. And please go forth and stay connected to us with the McCain Institute, and please keep up this fight. Thank you.